We're going to start the urinary system looking at the functions of the kidneys and the anatomy. The kidneys have a lot of functions, but the main one is to filter the blood and make urine. And the urine is going to contain the waste products that we no longer need. So for example, urea, that's a waste product from breaking down proteins. So remember when the amino acid is broken apart and we take that amino group off, that goes to the liver, made into urea, and then the kidneys will excrete that. Creatinine, that one comes from creatine phosphate, which remember that's used to make ATP in skeletal muscle. And uric acid is produced when RNA is broken down. Many of the medications that we take also are excreted in the urine, and food additives and pesticides that you may have ingested with your food, those are also excreted by the kidneys. The kidneys are really important to also regulate plasma ion concentrations. So there's a lot of different ions that we need to keep in the normal range. And if they get out of whack, some things can happen, especially with nerve and muscle function. The kidneys will also regulate plasma osmolarity, which is the solute concentration. And that's really important for the movement of water by osmosis. So you want to keep that in the normal range, because if it's too high or too low, that can affect the water levels in the cells. The kidneys also regulate the plasma volume. So they can either save extra water from the urine to increase the blood volume, and that would increase blood pressure, or they can urinate out more water, and that would decrease the blood volume and decrease blood pressure. The kidneys also help regulate the blood pH by either saving or secreting bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. And remember, the other system that regulates blood pH is the respiratory system. The kidneys also have an endocrine function. They also secrete several hormones. They do secrete erythropoietin, which remember that's going to go to the red bone marrow and tell it to make more red blood cells. The kidneys also secrete renin, which we're going to talk about later, but that ends up setting off a bunch of different steps that will increase the blood pressure. And then the kidneys will also activate vitamin D3 to the active form calcitriol. Remember that vitamin D3 will tell the intestines to absorb more calcium from your food and increase blood calcium levels. The kidneys do a little bit of gluconeogenesis, but most of it's going to be done by the liver. Remember, gluconeogenesis is when you make new glucose from things that are not carbohydrates. Let's take a look at the anatomy of the urinary system. It's pretty straightforward. We've got the two kidneys, and their blood supplies from the renal artery and renal vein. And then we've got the ureters, which are going to take the urine made by the kidneys down to the bladder where it will be temporarily stored. And then when you urinate, the urine will go out the urethra to the outside. So here's just a summary of the anatomy of the urinary system. We have our two kidneys, which their job is to filter the blood and make the urine. And we're going to look at their parts in just a minute. We have two ureters that are going to take the urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The bladder is going to temporarily store the urine. And then the urethra will take the urine from the bladder to the outside. And then the blood supply, we have the renal arteries and veins. And the kidneys have a very large blood supply. They will get 20% of the cardiac output at rest. And that's because the kidneys' main job is to filter the blood and get rid of the waste products. So it does get a lot of the blood from that. And then also the kidneys are very active. They need to make a lot of ATP because they do a lot of active transport, as we'll see later. So they need a large blood supply to keep bringing in glucose and oxygen so they can keep making ATP. With the anatomy of the kidneys, we have this outer part called the renal cortex. Remember, cortex means outer. And then in the middle here, we have the renal medulla. And then we have the renal pelvis, which is going to collect the urine that's made by the kidneys, and then the urine will then go down to the ureters and out to the bladder. If we take a closer look in the renal cortex and the renal medulla, you can see that there are millions of these nephrons. So the nephrons are the functional units of the kidneys. So they're actually going to be filtering the blood and making the urine. Each kidney has about 1.3 million nephrons, so we've got a lot of them. So the nephron consists of two different parts. We have the renal corpuscle and the renal tubules. The renal corpuscle consists of two parts. We have the glomerulus, which is a little tuft of capillaries, so it's a capillary bed. And then we have Bowman's capsule, where the filtrate or the urine we're starting to make is going to first enter into our renal tubules. And so the renal corpuscle, its big job is to filter the blood. The renal tubules are going to modify that filtrate that we filtered out from the blood and turn it into urine. And we have several different renal tubules, the proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule. And the distal convoluted tubule will then empty the filtrate into the collecting duct. So let's take a look at the anatomy of the nephron in this picture. The renal corpuscle is this round little thing right here. Corpuscle just means body, and it consists of this capillary bed inside, which is called the glomerulus, a little tuft of capillaries. Glom means ball because it's shaped like a little ball. And then surrounding the glomerulus, that capillary bed, we've got Bowman's capsule. So this is the start of the proximal convoluted tubule where the filtrate will first go. And then we have our renal tubule starting with our proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal just means that it's closest to the glomerulus and it's convoluted or twisted. And then going from the renal cortex, this outer part of the kidney, the loop of Henle will dip down into the renal medulla and then come back up. And then up here in the renal cortex, we have the distal convoluted tubule. It's further away from the glomerulus, so it's distal, and then it's also twisted or convoluted. And then that distal convoluted tubule will then empty into these collecting ducts, which will then take the urine into the renal pelvis. There are two different types of nephrons. We have juxtamedullary nephrons and cortical nephrons. Both of them do produce urine, but the juxtamedullary nephrons have an extra job. They have a much longer loop of Henle that goes much deeper down into the renal medulla, and they're going to be creating the medullary osmotic gradient, which we're going to talk about later, and it's really important because it allows you to concentrate your urine. Most of the nephrons, though, are going to be called our cortical nephrons, and they have a much shorter loop of Henle that does go down into the renal medulla, but just not as deep. We've got the cortical nephron on the left and the juxtamedullary nephron on the right. So you can see the juxtamedullary nephron, the loop of Henle is much longer, and it goes much farther down into the renal medulla, and that's going to create the medullary osmotic gradient, which is going to help concentrate your urine. And in the cortical nephron, you can see the loop of Henle is much shorter, and it doesn't go as far down into the renal medulla. The reason that the juxtamedullary nephrons got their name, juxta just means next to or nearby, and it's just talking about how this nephron is much closer to the renal medulla than the cortical nephron. With the blood supply of the nephron, the renal artery will go into the afferent arteriole. Remember, afferent means towards. And then that will enter into the glomerulus, the capillary bed or little tuft of capillaries. And then it will exit through the efferent arteriole. Remember, efferent means away from. And also notice that it's an arteriole and not a venule, so that's really different. And then we're going to go into a second capillary bed, the peritubular capillaries. So this is a portal system that we have in the nephron because we've got two capillary beds in a row. And instead of having a portal vein in between them, this is the only portal system in the body where we have an arteriole between the two capillary beds. And the other portal systems in the body, remember we talked about the one between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And then when we talk about the digestive system next, we're also going to see a portal system between the intestines and the liver. So let's take a look at some pictures. So here we have a cortical nephron on the left. We have our afferent arteriole coming in to the glomerulus, our capillary bed there. And then we're going to exit through the efferent arteriole, which will then enter into the second capillary bed, these peritubular capillaries. So peri just means around, and they're obviously around all of these renal tubules here. And then the peritubular capillaries will then go out into the renal vein. The juxtamedullary nephron, we have a little bit different names. So we still have the afferent arteriole coming into the glomerulus, that capillary bed there where we're going to filter the blood. And then we're going to exit through the efferent arteriole, enter into the peritubular capillaries. But then when the peritubular capillaries go down around the loop of Henle, because the loop of Henle is so long in these juxtamedullary nephrons, that peritubular capillaries really straighten out. And so it ends up being called the vasa recta. So vasa just talking about blood vessel, and recta means straight. And then from the vasa recta, around the loop of Henle, we will then exit to the renal vein. Let's take a closer look at the renal corpuscle of the nephron. So the glomerulus, that capillary bed, has a very high blood pressure. It's 60 millimeters of mercury. And remember when we talked about other capillary beds, the blood pressure there was 38 millimeters of mercury, so much higher blood pressure in the glomerulus. The reason the blood pressure needs to be so high is that if you have higher blood pressure, you can push more fluid from the blood out into the Bowman's capsule to make your urine. So blood pressure has to be high so we can filter more of the blood. And let's take a look at a picture to show you what makes the blood pressure so high in the glomerulus. So if you notice the afferent arteriole coming in, and then here we've got our glomerulus, our capillary bed there, and then we're going to exit through the efferent arteriole. The reason that the blood pressure is so high in the glomerulus, that capillary bed, is that if you look at the diameter of the efferent arteriole and compare that to the afferent arteriole, notice that the efferent arteriole is smaller than the afferent arteriole coming in. So you have more blood coming in through the afferent arteriole, and then it can't exit as quickly through the efferent arteriole because it has a smaller diameter. And so that will make the blood back up into the glomerulus, and that will increase the blood pressure up to 60 millimeters of mercury, which is good because that'll allow us to filter more fluid out of the blood. Bowman's capsule will surround the glomerulus. We've actually got two layers to Bowman's capsule. There's an outer layer. The inner layer is made up of cells called podocytes, and then we've got a capsular space in between the two layers of Bowman's capsule. So the filtrate, the fluids you're filtering out of the blood, will enter into this capsular space of Bowman's capsule and then start down the proximal convoluted tubule, and eventually it will be turned into urine. Another really important structure in the nephrons is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It's called that because juxta means next to or nearby, so this structure is next to the glomerulus. So it's located with a distal convoluted tubule, contacts the afferent and efferent arterioles, and we'll show you a picture of this in a second. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is made up of two different types of cells. We have the granular cells, which are also called juxtaglomerular cells, and they're actually specialized smooth muscle cells that are mostly around the afferent arteriole. and they are baroreceptors. So they're going to be checking what the blood pressure is coming into the glomerulus. And they will sense when the blood pressure is too low, and they will secrete renin, which will then set off the activation of some other hormones, and then that will increase the blood pressure. We also have the macula densa cells. These are epithelial cells that make up part of the wall of the distal convoluted tubule. And the macula densa cells are chemoreceptors, so they're going to sense the salt or the sodium and chloride concentration that's in the filtrate. And then that will help regulate the glomerular filtration rate, so how much blood we're filtering at the glomerulus. Let's take a look at the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Notice we have the afferent arteriole coming into the glomerulus, our capillary bed there, and then we have the efferent arteriole exiting. And coming right up in between the afferent and efferent arteriole is our distal convoluted tubule. And here's a close-up view. You can see the afferent arteriole coming into the glomerulus where you'll do your filtration of the blood. And then here's the efferent arteriole exiting. And then this is the distal convoluted tubule. So we've got two types of cells making up the juxtaglomerular apparatus. We have the granular cells, which are colored in purple here. So they're going to be mostly around the afferent arteriole, and they're going to be baroreceptors sensing the blood pressure. And if the blood pressure gets too low, they will secrete renin, and that will act to increase the blood pressure. The reason they're called granular cells is because you can actually see little granules of renin inside of them. The other cell type that makes up the juxtaglomerular apparatus would be the macula densa cells. So they're kind of this darker brown color. They make up part of the wall of the distal convoluted tubule, and they're going to sense the sodium and chloride levels that is in the filtrate. And if it gets too low or too high, that means that the filtration rate at the glomerulus is not at the right point. So they will help regulate the glomerular filtration rate, how much blood is being filtered at the glomerulus.